The perfect portrait lens. Does it exist? In this video, I will suggest 10 different lenses for portrait photography, some of which may surprise you. I have been a professional photographer for over 20 years, and photography has been in my interest for at least 40 years. What is a portrait? Some people argue that any photograph of a person can be considered a portrait. However, I believe a true portrait is formed when there is a genuine connection between the photographer and the subject. This connection happens when both individuals are in sync with each other at that moment. In other words, a photograph taken in a paparazzi style without the subject's consent does not qualify as a portrait. I really love this photo of my mother and me in a photo booth instead of using a photographer. Would this qualify as a portrait? In my view, portraits can typically be divided into two categories. The first category comprises headshots, which are intended for professional use, while the second category encompasses portraits that convey a person's attitude and personality. I refer to these as emotional portraits, and they will be the focus of this video. Emotion in a person is an essential part of a portrait. It can convey happiness, sadness, melancholy, contentment, or excitement. Personally, I prefer a natural expression. If they smile, fine. If they don't smile, it's also fine. In my view, any lens can be used to make a portrait of someone. However, when choosing a lens for a headshot, keep it simple. I would suggest starting off using an 85mm or thereabouts. However, for this corporate headshot, I used the Sigma 50 1.4 art lens, which I absolutely love and always carry with me on a photo shoot. Here you can see my Sigma 50 attached to a camera body and stuffed into my wheelie bag. One lens that you might not typically consider going for when having a portrait session is Nikon's wide-angle 18x35 zoom lens. I carry this lens mainly for interior assignments. However, now and then when I want to show a different view of a subject or the sitter, I grab this lens for a portrait. In my view, this works best when stopped down a peg or two, and when I use this lens for a portrait and in a studio setting with an artificial light source, I usually stop down to between 9 or 12 or thereabouts. Another lens that you might not typically consider for portrait photography is Nikon's 14-24. This 2.8 beast is even wider than the previously mentioned 18-35 zoom. To be honest, I don't use this lens much for portraits either, but I have captured a few amusing shots with it. While it's heavy, somewhat cumbersome, and quite expensive, it is worth the investments for interior work. However, I wouldn't recommend rushing out to buy this lens solely for portrait purposes. Nikon's 24-70 2.8. This lens is a reliable all-round choice that many photojournalists prefer because of its versatility. However, nowadays I find it to be a bit heavy for my liking. I used it more during my travels than in a studio portrait setting. Unfortunately, mine was stolen and I didn't feel the need to replace it. Nonetheless, it produces excellent photos. The 28 2.8 AIS Nikon lens. Is this the perfect wide-angle lens? Probably. It's hard not to appreciate this AIS version from Nikon. In my view, it checks all the boxes. It's lightweight, sharp, produces beautiful bokeh, and gives images an analog feel to them. If I decide to use a wide-angle lens for portraits, this is the first one I grab. I won't explore this lens any further here. If you're interested, I have created a special video about it, which is linked in the description below. The 28 1.8 lens from Nikon. I will mention this lens briefly since it has the same focal length as the previous one, but I can say that I have taken some fun photographs with it, although I don't have it anymore. The 105 2.5 from Nikon. I suppose this is the classic focal length for a portrait lens, which gained legendary status when Steve McCurry used it to photograph the Afghan girl. A striking portrait of the 12-year-old Sharbat Gula a Pashtun orphan who appeared on the cover of National Geographic in 1985. Here is my endeavor to use it to photograph a young Malaysian girl. I feel like we rushed through Nikon's 85 1.4 lens too quickly, so I think it's time to revisit it. This lens was my preferred choice for portrait photography for a long time. As I discuss this lens, I would like to share some of the portraits I've created with it and give you a bit of the history of the lens. When Nikon developed this lens, their goal wasn't to create the fastest or sharpest 85mm lens. Instead, it aimed for the ideal imaging characteristics specifically for portrait photography. This lens was launched in December 1995 and was designed by Koichi Oshita. Let's return to the 50mm focal length. This is, in my view, probably the most versatile length for portrait lens. Currently, I have three different for my DSLRs. Nikon's 50mm 1.8e, also called the pancake lens, a Sigma 50mm 1.4 art lens, and a Nikon's AFS 50mm 1.8G. They all have their benefits. The Sigma, as mentioned earlier, is my favorite. Nikon's G lens has fast autofocus, weighs almost nothing, and creates nice pics. The small manual pancake lens does not take up any real estate when mounted on one of my DSLRs. So what's the verdict then, you ask? The headline of this video is about discovering whether there is a perfect lens for portrait photography. For me, if I had to choose just one lens, it would be the 50mm focal length. So my reasoning is this. The 50mm is wide enough, allowing background elements to be included in the story, while at the same time not creating too much distortion. After making that choice, considerations such as brand preference, budget constraints, and practical handling come into play. Once again, this is just my perspective. While I demonstrate my thoughts, I will showcase a selection of my portraits, all taken with a 50mm focal length lens, though they may come from different manufacturers. When taking a portrait, I believe that having an intimate connection with the subject or the sitter is very important. This is one reason why I avoid using long telephoto lenses. I have a personal mantra. I want to be able to talk to my subject in a normal speaking voice. I don't want to yell directions to them just because I'm using a long lens. Instead, I prefer to have them close enough to be within an arm's length. Some photographers may have only access to a 35mm lens, but do not fret. It can be used for portraits. Others might have invested in an expensive zoom lens, which is also perfectly fine. What I mean to convey is that the focal length of your lens shouldn't prevent you from creating a great portrait. If you feel that the quality of your work isn't meeting your expectations, try to look at other aspects of your photography rather than the lens itself. Conclusion then. Use an 85 or thereabouts for headshots. For an emotional or environmental portrait, try a 50 first. And do not be afraid to experiment with wider lenses. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, please give a thumbs up. And feel free to subscribe to my channel if you like to see more content. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.